Pathways Through to Space, an Experiential Journal by Franklin Merrell-Wolff. Introduction by John C. Lilly, M.D. Chapter 1. The Light Breaks Forth, August 17th, 1936. The ineffable transition came about 10 days ago. We had just returned to our Southern California home after a few weeks' stay in a small town in the Motherlode country in the northern part of the state, and I was resting from the fatigue induced by the all-night driving of the automobile. At the time, I was engaged in the reading of portions of The System of the Vedanta by Paul Deussen, as I had been doing more or less systematically during the preceding 3 weeks. This work is an interpretation in Western philosophic form of the Vedanta as it is developed in the commentaries of Shankara on the Brahma Sutras. I had been led to this specific program of reading through the realization that Shankara's words had peculiar power, at least in my own experience. For some time, I had spontaneously looked to him as to a guru with whom I was in complete sympathetic accord. Footnote: Guru is a Sanskrit term carrying the meaning of spiritual teacher. I had found him always clear and convincing, at least in all matters relative to the analysis of consciousness, while with the other sages I either found obscurities or emphases with which I could not feel complete sympathy. For some months I had resolved to delve more deeply into the thought of Shankara insofar as it was available in translated form. It was in pursuance of this purpose that I was slowly reading and meditating upon the system of the Vedanta. I had been following this course while completing a crosscut in a gold prospect near the small town of Michigan Bluff. Much of this time I was completely alone and was more than usually successful in penetrating the meaning and following the logic of what I was reading. One day, after the evening meal, and while still sitting at the table, I found that, by gradual transition, I had passed into a very delightful state of contemplation. The actual content of the thought of that period is forgotten, but as I made careful note of the state I was in and submitted it to close scrutiny, the quality of the state was well impressed upon my memory. My breath had changed, but not in the sense of stopping or becoming extremely slow or rapid. It was, perhaps, just a little slower than normal. The notable change was in a subtle quality associated with the air breathed. Over and above the physical gases of the air, there seemed to be an impalpable substance of indescribable sweetness, which, in turn, was associated with a general sense of well-being, embracing even the physical man. It was like happiness or joy, but these words are inadequate. It was of a very gentle quality, yet far transcended the value of any of the more familiar forms of happiness. It was quite independent of the beauty or comfort of the environment. At that time the latter was, to say the least, austere and in not any sense attractive. This quality, associated with the air, I had, in a smaller measure, previously experienced at high altitudes in the mountains, but in the present instance the altitude was only 1,800 feet, and the air was far from invigorating, due to the period being exceptionally warm. However, introspective analysis revealed the fact that the elixir-like quality was most marked during the exhalation, thus indicating that it was not derived from the surrounding air. Further, the exhaled breath was not simply air expelled into the outer atmosphere, but seemed to penetrate down through the whole organism like a gentle caress, leaving throughout a quiet sense of delight. It seemed to me like a nectar. Since that time I have learned that it is the true ambrosia. It is perhaps pertinent to note in passing that a few days previously as a result of thought stimulated by my readings, I had developed an interpretation of the nature of ponderable matter that seemed to me to clear away certain logical difficulties which always have seemed to persist in the efforts to reconcile transcendent being with the physical universe. The idea is that ponderable matter, meaning by that term all things sensed, whether gross or subtle, is in fact a relative absence of substance, a sort of partial vacuum. At the present time I shall not develop the evidence and logic supporting this idea, though this was outlined in my consciousness during the days following the origin of it. The significant point in connection with the present record is the effect this idea had upon my own consciousness. It seems to have had a vital part in clearing the way for the illumination that came later. This effect was produced in the following manner. Habitually, we regard the material filling of sensation as being substantial. To offset this, we may have been theoretically convinced that the so-called empty space is not only filled but actually more substantial than the portions of it occupied by ponderable matter. This idea is not new to metaphysics, and much in the literature of modern physics is not incompatible with it, but I have found that ideas received from outer sources, even though in convincing form, lack the power over consciousness possessed by an original idea. Footnote: by original, I do not mean an idea that has never been thought before, but one which, for the individual, has been produced with a creative effort from himself. The effect of this idea with me was a far more effective acceptance of substantial reality where the senses reported emptiness, and a greater capacity to realize unreality or merely dependent and derivative reality in the material given through the senses. There are further prior pertinent factors which, it seems, should be noted. About 18 months ago, there began a series of conversations with one whom I recognized as a sage. I checked the validity of my recognition of this one in every way that I could, and proved his genuineness to my complete satisfaction. I acted on his word when I could not see clearly, and found that clarity gradually unfolded. Acting upon his suggestions, Sharifa, my wife, and I undertook a phase of public work not hitherto attempted. Both of us found as we progressed in the work a gradual growth of understanding that has steadily brought light where there had been obscurity. Among other things, this sage suggested my correlation with a previous incarnation of special importance. He advised me that he was not and could not be my personal guru, as that relationship was dependent upon alignments that are not arbitrary. In the past, two important recognitions have come to me. First, nearly 14 years ago, in a setting which it is not necessary to delineate, I suddenly recognized I am Atman. This affected important changes of outlook that persisted. Second, less than 1 year ago, while engaged in the public work mentioned above, and while deeply interested in a book giving a report of a living Indian sage, I also suddenly recognized that nirvana is not a field or space or world which one entered, and that contained one as space might contain an external object, but rather that I am identical with nirvana, and always have been and always will be so. This recognition, likewise, had its persistent effects upon the personal consciousness.